Welcome to News from Neptune for August 9th in the 32nd week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government a century ago, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist actually means. It's not easy, owing to several generations, of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism, in Karl Marx's sense, in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialists made immense strides in the 20th century, notably in Russia and China. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a Nagasaki Holocaust edition of News from Neptune. August 6th and 9th mark 74 years since the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where only one nuclear bomb dropped on each city caused the deaths of up to 146,000 people in Hiroshima and 80,000 people in Nagasaki. General Dwight Eisenhower, you may have heard of him, he went on to a political career after the war. General Dwight Eisenhower stated in his memoirs that when notified by Secretary of War Henry Stimson of the decision to use the atomic weapons, he, Eisenhower, voiced to him my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and secondly because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives. Close quote. Eisenhower later publicly declared it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. Close quote. Even the famous hawk, Major General Curtis LeMay, head of the 21st Bomber Command, went public the month after the bombing, telling the press that, quote, the atomic bomb had nothing to do with the end of the war at all, close quote. Japan was already defeated. The purpose of using the bomb was different. The United States decided to use the bomb that had developed on Japan mainly to intimidate the Soviet Union. And that's become clear in the many years after the atomic bombings of human beings in Japan by the United States. When the explosive power, that is the megatonnage, of the U.S. nuclear arsenal peaked in 1960, it was equivalent to 1,366,000 Hiroshima-style bombs. That's what the post-war United States developed. Today's operational stockpile contains the equivalent of more than 91,000 Hiroshimas. So this is the seriousness which we take the matter is justified. Now with the U.S. decision to walk away from the 1987 intermediate-range nuclear force negotiated with the Soviet Union, we're once again staring into the abyss of one of the most perilous nuclear challenges since the height of the Cold War. We'll have some more to say about that later in the program. David, you want to turn to another matter, right?
Well, in the wake of last weekend's shootings, there's been, of course, increased debate about notions of race and racism and white supremacy. And I have to say that I continue to find the discourse about race and racism and white supremacy in relation to Donald Trump, to some of his followers, and to the people who perpetrate these shootings and their manifestos that they post online and so forth, or their known history of political beliefs. I continue to find this discourse unhelpful at understanding what this phenomenon of this violence is, where it comes from, what the context for it is, how to analyze it in some helpful way, and what can be, of course, hopefully to the end of proposing what can be done about it. I continue to be left confused or perplexed or just cold by what I hear on liberal to left, what I read on liberal to left or hear on liberal to left programs or read on liberal to left websites, including to a certain extent Counterpunch, to a great extent Counterpunch. Carl, if you've been following that at all, it seems like we need to begin to understand these things in a kind of a different context. We've been talking about this program week after week. One reference I would make right at the beginning of the show, going back to Adolph Reed and what his views are on race and class, I came across a more recent interview with him on a program that I never listened to before and probably never will listen to again, called Oats for Breakfast from Canada. And there was two, if you look that up, and I'm sure our researcher J.B. Nicholson will post this on his notes for this program. There's two 30-minute interviews with Adolph Reed by these two very competent people in Canada, very straightforward, very concise, and it gives Adolph Reed a chance to explain how he has differed basically for decades with what he calls what Glenn Ford has come to call the black misleadership class. There's a new member. This is not part of what Reed was talking about. This was back in March. There's a new representative of potential representative being touted as this black leadership class. I heard him. I saw that he had been interviewed on Amy Goodman a couple weeks ago, and then he has been touted in the New York Times. So he's here, and he's coming, and he's been promoted by the proper liberal establishment forces. And the article in the New York Times about him, this fellow's name Ibram X. Kendi, Kendi, and the article in the New York Times about him is called "Abram X. Kendi Has a Cure for America's Metastatic Racism." And I have to say, he's a follower of Molefi Kete Asante, a leading theorist of Afrocentrism. He's being touted in the lineage of W.E.B. Du Bois and Alan Locke and Henry Louis Gates and Cornel West, some of whom say things that I actually like. Obviously, at least two of those people say things that I actually like or that I think are relevant now. But I'm not impressed with Mr. Kendi. I know I'm supposed to be. I know it's not nice of me to be suspicious of what's going on here, but I can't help but be, because of the context in which he's being touted and because of the fact that nothing he is saying really it seems to me to be helpful and incisive in terms of understanding whatever it is we mean by racism, anti-racism, white supremacy, and so forth in our current context, which is nothing new. He's not the only one doing that. Amy Goodman the other day, subsequent to the death of Toni Morrison and subsequent to the shootings, this would have been probably Tuesday or so, Monday or Tuesday, had on three illustrious African-American women to talk about both of these things. One of them was Angela Davis, Another one was an author and longtime poet and activist named Giovanni. And another one was another well-known writer named Sonia Sanchez. And I have to say that what they said about Toni Morrison is neither here nor there in this context, but I have to say that what they say about racism and anti-racism, again, I find not particularly incisive, enlightening, or helpful in understanding it. It seems like a kind of Oprah Winfrey kind of a thing more than a serious discussion of what is going on in terms of racism and race in this country, which I won't repeat what I've said on recent programs. Another person, a woman who happens to be white and a historian at the University of Chicago, Kathleen Belew, Belew, has also in these contexts is making a name for herself as a kind of academic spokesperson for a kind of liberal to left establishment point of view. Thus, she's being published. She is having op-ed pieces published in the New York Times, which is a sign of something, as we know, not always something good. And I read her book. I read her book a couple of times, The War Comes Home, which traces the white power movement all the way from the Greensboro shootings in 1979 to Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City in 1995, trying to establish the argument there's this kind of lineage here that we can talk about in terms of white power. And the problem that I had with her book, which I think I spoke to on this program, or maybe not, is that I don't like the way even though she refers to the war in Vietnam as being the source of a lot of this nonsense, and a lot of this white reactionism against the government, not just against black people, but against the government. Even though she speaks to this, she doesn't, I think, fairly account for what actually happened at places like Ruby Ridge and Waco. And so her book leaves me wondering what's going on there with her understanding of that and the political agenda behind that. So with that preface, I want to read, I'm sorry, a relatively lengthy quote here about Timothy McVeigh that ended up in the post-shooting discussions on Louis Proyect's Mark's mail list by a fellow who contributes there frequently or regularly named Amit Gupta. And a little out of context, but just let me read this about what he was saying about Timothy McVeigh and how that reflects on, I think, a better understanding of the white power movement, the violence, the relation to the anti-war movement and racism and so forth. Amit Gupta wrote, there was little indication that he, Timothy McVeigh, was motivated by the same factors as the El Paso shooter or the other neo-Nazi terrorists, i.e. a belief in a conspiratorial genocide against white people. The only indications that I could find were the fact that he had the Turner Diaries in his possession. That is unsurprising given the plot of the book is about citizens carrying out an armed insurgency against the government, albeit they are all racists. I recall reading, I can't find which he couldn't find. I recall reading how McVeigh thought of the book as a useful guide for carrying out terrorist plots against the government, but rejected its race-related messaging. Likewise, he apparently bought a white power shirt from the KKK during a protest and counter-protest when he was in the military. But from what I can find, it is a little more than a shirt that says Sic Semper Tyrannis, with a photo of Lincoln. As I'm sure you know, these are words that Booth stated before assassinating Lincoln. Given the lack of involvement with active Nazi militias at any point in his life, and complete lack of any race war related commentary in any statements he made prior to or after the bombing, I find it a stretch to throw him in with these other guys, as Ballou was doing in her New York Times op-ed column, though he clearly had some sort of flirtations with other people who had those views. The letters he wrote prior to his execution and other statements he made during his life would indicate that while he was very much a right-winger, the primary factors behind his violence were being desensitized to mass killings during his military service in Iraq and watching the heavily militarized response of the U.S. government to various groups in the United States, including Randy Weaver, that's the Ruby Ridge murders, FBI murders, and the branch Davidians, the Waco, the FBI Janet Reno, Bill Clinton murders in Texas. Those responses, Gupta goes on, those responses involved killing many people and, at least in the Weaver case, involved an ultimately successful entrapment defense, i.e. Randy Weaver, it was his wife who was murdered, his wife and child actually, was murdered. And he notes that Weaver was, on this basis, acquitted from his own violence. Weaver and his family were actually white nationalists, but the outrage about the attack on that family was hardly limited to people who share their ideological views. Indeed, it was an absolutely ridiculous use of force against a guy they had tried to get on a manufactured gun charge, knowing that he had small children and a wife who was killed in the home. There is no evidence that the Branch Davidians practiced white supremacy at all. They were just a crazy religious cult led by a maniacal abuser. In other words, McVeigh realized that the U.S. government did not mind when he killed people under their orders and decided that the same ethical rules should apply when fighting the U.S. government, which was a fight that he justified by pointing to the police killings mentioned above. Beyond that, there is nothing to suggest that he wanted to kill people because of their race, drive non-whites out of the country, etc. Given the quickness of people on the left to jump at the neo-Nazi racist angle whenever there is some kind of large attack, including Dayton, which, as I pointed out, was carried out by someone who identified as a leftist, we should be careful not to sweep with a broad brush. The bigger issue that McVeigh brings out is not white supremacy, it is the dehumanizing and desensitizing effect of U.S. wars and the resultant effects when those aspects of war, including militarization of the police, are launched domestically. So I will just conclude by saying again, all of these understandings, when we really look at things like Ruby Ridge and Waco, certain aspects of the so-called white supremacist movement, and the casual and careless, I think, use of the broad brush of white supremacy and anti-racism, we find much to think about. Unfortunately, I don't think this is being thought about seriously by much of the discourse, including by Ibram Zendi or by Kathleen Ballou in her New York Times articles, or even on the Counterpunch website, from what I've read in the last day or two from there.
Thank you, David. There's a lot there that ties together the things we have been speaking about. You are watching News from Neptune, where our task is to talk about the news of the week and its coverage by the media and try to understand it better than that media coverage normally does. I want to turn to a matter now that our chief researcher, Jeff Nicholson, has summarized for us and brought to our attention. That's the question of the murder of Seth Rich. this needs to be put in the context of a good bit of recent American political history and some dark suggestions about what is actually being done by our national political leaders. The Mueller report, the report that was supposed to reveal the collusion between the Trump administration, the Trump presidency, and the government of Russia, begins with an account of the hacking of the Democratic National Committee's precious emails. These are emails that talked about the mopery and dopery that was being practiced by the Clinton campaign in order to undercut Sanders' campaign before the 2016 election. The assertion at the beginning of the Mueller report is that, it's not argued for, it's asserted, that the Russians hacked the email of the Democratic National Committee, and therefore all this embarrassing stuff about what the Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee were doing was free for all to see, and that clearly was a nefarious involvement with the American election system by the Russians. The point is that that's probably not true. The exposure of the DNC and Clinton emails was not done by Russian hacking, but was done probably by a member of the DNC campaign committee, a young man called Seth Rich, who was subsequently murdered in the streets of Washington, D.C., and a great effort was made by officialdom to say that this was just a matter of street crime. It had nothing to do with Rich's involvement with the Democratic National Committee or the Clinton campaign. Au contraire, it seems to be the case that Seth Rich was the courier for those emails that the Mueller report begins by saying had been hacked by the Russians, that the Russians never did hack those emails. They were delivered to WikiLeaks one way or another by Seth Rich, the corpse on the streets of Washington, who I suppose acted out Mrs. Clinton's notion that the way to deal with WikiLeaks was to drone them. Well, in Seth Rich's case, they did, very likely. More people are saying that the DNC email disclosures to WikiLeaks before the election was an inside job, a leak, not a hack, obtained over the internet, as Hillary Clinton and so many Russiagate supporters say without evidence. San Francisco Bay Area independent journalist Ann Garrison's article on a 20-minute discussion between Seymour Hersh and Ed Butowski, which was recorded and posted to YouTube, opens up this question. Seymour Hersh is the longtime investigative reporter who has, over the years, revealed the truth behind American lies about such things as the My Lai massacre in Vietnam and the killing of Osama bin Laden. Ed Butowski is a peculiar figure, a Fox News commentator at one point and a financial consultant, he says, otherwise. His claim is that negative press about Seth Rich's involvement, that is, that Seth Rich was the conduit for these emails, not the Russians, hurt Butowski's business. Butowski told that story, first on Fox News, and then when he was relieved of employment there, elsewhere. Very few news outlets are carrying any word of the lawsuit that grew out of Butowski's firing. RT remains the Russian equivalent of the BBC, remains one of the best sources for straight talk on this issue. They have given an account that's far more plausible and far more reliable, I think, than what you hear in the American media. Black Agenda Report which is an American news source website, is very good on this matter, too. It talks about a Project Russiagate supporter, Michael Isikoff, started trying to distract people from paying any attention to the news which says that Seth Rich had anything to do with the DNC emails, or that those emails were leaked and not illicitly obtained by Russians via the internet. Garrison transcribed and summarized some part of that conversation between Seymour Hersh and Butowski. Seymour Hersh, I'm quoting now, "I'll tell you what I know. What I know comes off an FBI report. Don't ask me how. You can figure out I've been around long enough. This is according to the FBI report. What they find is that Rich makes contact. First of all, you have to know some basic facts. One of the basic facts is there's no DNC or Podesta is head of the Democratic National Committee, or Podesta email that exists beyond May 22nd. That is, in the materials were published by WikiLeaks. May 21st, May 22nd are the last emails from either one of those groups. And so what the report says is that sometime in late spring, we're talking about June, summer, June 21st, late spring, would be after, I suppose, I don't know. I'd just say late spring, early summer, Seth Rich makes contact with WikiLeaks. Then in his computer, the stuff's in his computer, and he makes contact. FBI investigators found what he had done. He had submitted a series of documents of emails, some juicy emails from the DNC to WikiLeaks. He offered a sample, an extensive sample. I'm sure dozens of emails that said, dozens of emails is what he offered, and said he wanted to be paid. Later, WikiLeaks did get the password. And that a long story of Chelsea Manning here, but WikiLeaks got the password to this collection of materials. He had a Dropbox, a protected Dropbox, which isn't hard to do. I mean, you don't have to be a wizard, an IT wizard. He was certainly not a dumb kid. This is Seymour Hersh talking about Seth Rich. And they got access to the Dropbox. Rich also, and this is also in the FBI report, he'd also let people know with whom he was dealing. And I don't know how he dealt. I'll tell you about WikiLeaks in a second. I don't know how he dealt with WikiLeaks, the mechanism, but he also, the word was passed, according to the FBI report, quote, I also shared this box with a couple of friends, so if anything happens to me, it's not going to solve your or their problem, close quote. Hersh says, okay, I don't know quite what that means. I don't know what he was worried about. Anyway, but WikiLeaks got access, and before he was killed. Butowski. But what you're saying is that he uploaded stuff into a WikiLeaks Dropbox, and they pulled it down, and that's where the Podesta and DNC emails came from. Hersh. It doesn't preclude Russians also hacking them. I just don't think that. It's always Occam's razor. WikiLeaks, Occam's razor is the simplest explanation is to be preferred, and he's saying the simple explanation here is that the stuff Seth Rich put together went to WikiLeaks, even if there were Russian attempts to hack that email. Butowski says, but I want to stay focused on one thing just for a moment. You saw the FBI report? Seymour Hersh, no. I have somebody on the inside. I've been around a long time, and I read a lot of stuff. I have somebody on the inside who will go and read a file for me. He says he's a source in the FBI. And I know this person is unbelievably accurate and careful. He's a very high-level guy, and he'll do me a favor. Butowski, is there any way we can get our hands on the report? Hersh responded that he could not risk exposing his high-level FBI source by sharing a document, even if he could get one. He then asked Butowski to tell him what he knew. Hersh says, my pen is down. I'm not quoting you about anything. I know that. What do you know? Butowski, I know that Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks, told a friend of mine who met with him that he got the emails from Seth Rich. Whoa, says Hersh. And they're very personal friends, says Butowski. Hersh said that he had been working on the story since August 2016 because he foresaw that Russia would be blamed for the email leaks. Hirsch. I've been doing this story since the late summer because I smelled it. I smelled it in August, okay? That's the fallback, that the fallback was going to be Russia, that the Democratic campaign, the Clinton campaign, was going to blame these embarrassing emails and their revelation on Russia and shift the question from what the email said to how they got into the public notice. What's odd is that nowhere in Garrison's, an otherwise interesting article, do you find any mention of Craig Murray, former British ambassador to Uzbekistan. There's reason to believe that Murray played a pivotal role in explaining how the DNC emails got from the DNC leaker to WikiLeaks. John Kiriakou is a former CIA agent, the only man who went to prison for the U.S. government torture program, and he went to prison because he revealed the program. John Kiriakou spoke with Redacted Tonight's Lee Camp, a YouTube program that I recommend highly. Kiriakou said that Murray was the courier, Craig Murray, the former British ambassador, who has a very interesting blog up right now on these matters. Kiriakou said that Murray was the courier for the leaked DNC emails, physically obtaining a USB key containing those emails from Seth Rich on the night of the 2016 Sam Adams Award ceremony, and later conveying those emails to WikiLeaks. A side note here, the 2016 Sam Adams Award ceremony, it's not named for the American Revolutionary, it was named for a rogue CIA agent. And this is a group founded by Ray McGovern, who was himself
I thought maybe it was named for a beer, but okay.
It's the other way around. The beer is named for the Revolutionary and so forth. Whatever they were drinking, the fact of the matter was that the Sam Adams dinner was the occasion, apparently, when the email collection on a thumb drive was passed by Seth Rich, who worked for the DNC, to WikiLeaks. And that was also the night he was killed. Kiriakou said that Craig Murray, the Englishman, he's actually a Scotsman. That's another story. Kiriakou said that Murray was
like a 2,000-year story.
It's important in terms of the fights around Brexit right now, which are not just entertainment, but are deeply involved with British and American foreign policy. Yeah. In any case, Kiriakou said that Murray was the courier for the leaked DNC emails, physically obtaining a USB key containing those emails from Seth Rich on the night of the 2016 Sam Adams Award ceremony, and later conveying those emails to WikiLeaks. Consider this exchange between Kiriakou and Lee Camp, the television man, during a discussion of the Robert Mueller report and Mueller's investigation into alleged collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. Lee Camp said, and this is one of the many holes in the Mueller report, which still found no collusion, but they, the FBI, didn't even talk to Julian Assange. Kiriakou said they never even asked to talk to Julian Assange. Lee Camp, it's amazing. John Kiriakou. And I'll tell you who else they didn't talk to was Ambassador Craig Murray. Craig's the former ambassador to Uzbekistan, the British ambassador. He came to the U.S. right around that time in 2016 to participate in the Sam Adams Award ceremony, this collection of dissident CIA people. Sam Adams is a group of retired CIA, NSA, other intelligence officers, and we were giving an award. Well, Craig loves to go out drinking after these award ceremonies. That night he didn't. That night he said he had an important meeting, and it turned out his important meeting was to meet someone who he has never named, who gave him a thumb drive with all of the information on it, all the DNC emails, which he then took to WikiLeaks. Kiriakou continues, so if he's come out to confess that it was not a hack, not a Russian hack, I physically carried the documents to WikiLeaks, why did the FBI never want to interview him? Lee Camp, the television man, says that's incredible. I didn't even know that detail, but there's been a lot of other evidence brought forward that this was not a hack, it was a leak. It was from the inside. Kiriakou says it was. Bill Binney, the former technical director at the NSA, technical director at the NSA is a fairly big deal, the former technical director at the NSA has said repeatedly, including in the Oval Office, that the rate of speed with the information at which the information was uploaded proves that it could not possibly have been done remotely. It had to have been done on site, i.e. by somebody within the campaign, on a thumb drive. And that upends the whole Russia did it idea that the Mueller report is based on. If this is correct, Hersh's story and Kiriakou's story are compatible. Hersh describes Rich getting WikiLeaks attention and arranging to be paid by WikiLeaks. This part happens electronically using, quote, some juicy emails from the DNC, as Hersh said to Butowski, so Rich can prove his legitimacy to WikiLeaks. Neither conversation above makes it clear how WikiLeaks got the passphrase to decrypt this set of emails. If, as Hersh said, Seth Rich, quote, let people know with whom he was dealing, identified himself, this could also help explain how the DNC knew it was Rich, that it was Rich who was conveying DNC emails to WikiLeaks. This helps explains how someone at the DNC knew whom to kill, either to prevent the release of those emails or whom to punish for having released copies of emails. That's what's being said here. What we're explaining is how people knew that Seth Rich was the leaker, and the people were the people within the Clinton campaign and the DNC who it suggested killed Rich to keep him quiet. Not just to keep him quiet, but to prevent the refutation of the fundamental point of the Mueller report that it was Russia who hacked these emails. Seth Rich could say, no, it wasn't. It was I did it. Here's the thumb drive that I took the emails out on. That is the one thing the Clinton campaign couldn't, and the DNC in general, and the entire Mueller report for that matter, couldn't countenance a refutation of the bedrock principle of the Russiagate story. Once the deal between Rich and WikiLeaks is made, Rich now has to provide the full copy of the DNC emails to WikiLeaks. No computer network is needed for this. Seth Rich used his IT skill and server access to copy the emails to a USB thumb drive. I thought I had one with me. They're easy to lose. The copying was not hard. Rich arranged to meet Murray, Britt, on the night of the 2016 Sam Adams ceremony. Rich gave Murray that thumb drive, which had the DNC emails, and Murray later conveyed those emails to WikiLeaks, possibly also done in person by simply handing a WikiLeaks representative the same USB thumb drive. So contrary to Butowski's claim that Hersh's version of events doesn't preclude Russians also hacking the DNC emails, it pretty much does, particularly for someone who observes Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is to be preferred. Russian involvement requires a different set of explanations than an insider leaking the DNC emails to WikiLeaks and being murdered for his leak. Russian involvement over the Internet, as Russiagate supporters claim, has been debunked by Bill Binney, the technical man from NSA, remember, and his group in experiments transferring data over the Internet. That group couldn't come anywhere close to transferring the amount of data needed in the time span that matches information gleaned from the email data. The conversation continues. Butowski says, I know what Julian Assange told a friend of mine who met with him, that he got the emails from Seth Rich. Seymour Hersh says, whoa, that's first direct account of that. Butowski, they're very personal friends. This very personal friends could indeed have been Craig Murray, the man Kiriakou said was the courier of the USB key containing the DNC emails. Abby Martin, a longtime independent reporter, talks with Bill Binney, the NSA's technical man, about how we know the DNC emails were leaked from the inside and not obtained remotely over the Internet by Russians or anybody else. Abby Martin says, let's move on to the allegations of Russian hacking into Podesta's email account at the DNC. Can you first go over the evidence that Mueller claims to have that proves that it's Russia? Binney says, well, you see, I really don't know of any evidence that Mueller has because he's never made it public. So the only evidence I have is what's made public. And from that, it went into the Rosenstein indictment, the Guccifer II and the D.C. leaks data, the suggestions of the way in which the Russians had got this material. And they talked about that as the evidence for the indictments and so on. They claim that Guccifer II is a Russian, but the timestamps that we have on the programming inside the data that was published by Guccifer II shows timestamps that are consistently inside the United States. But that's not the real issue. The real issue was with the data itself and how quickly it was downloaded. It was incompatible with a transfer across the net to anywhere or any distance. If it went beyond the high-speed line that you had dedicated to you, then it slowed down. Abby Martin, explain that in layman's terms. Why you think this was an inside leak as opposed to a hack? Binney, okay, well, the fastest download speed we had was a 49.1 megabyte rate. This is the layman's terms, she asked for, which meant that the hacker was taking the data out at that rate across the network, wherever they were. They could be local, they could be anywhere. Well, we said, okay, what is the capacity of the lines going across to Europe? And at that point, everything failed. You couldn't get it across that fast. But you could do a thumb drive or something local. Some of our people disagreed with that. They said they thought it could. So we said, okay, we'll try it. So we've got hacker friends in Europe trying to, and a friend in the U.S. to put up a gigabyte of data and say, here, try to pull it across, see how fast you can get it. And the fastest they could get was from a data center in New Jersey to the U.K. and London. And that was 12 megabytes per second, less than 1/4 the necessary capacity to transmit the data alone. Abby Martin says, well, what about the timestamps? Do you think that Russia could have been throwing off analysis by planting false timestamps? Binney, first off, to understand the massive surveillance, understand the massive surveillance that's involved. Everything is captured by NSA. So NSA should have some of that evidence somewhere. And they failed to come forward, even the ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment, that Russia hacked it, NSA had moderate confidence. Martin says, right, what does that mean? Bill Binney says, that means we have no evidence. Abby Martin says, because the other intelligence agencies said they had confidence, but the NSA said they had moderate confidence. Binney says, you see, they aren't relevant. When it comes to communication, NSA is the only one who matters. The rest of them don't. Martin, and did they explain what the moderate confidence they had meant? Binney, no. To me, that's language for, I have no evidence. Abby Martin, I wanted to get this out of the way because it's always interested me, because you claim that British diplomat Craig Murray corroborates this. Binney, yes. He claims that he handed over a drive to someone. Binney, well, he talked to somebody who was involved in transferring the data, yeah. Abby Martin, so he himself talked to someone. Binney, but even from the forensic evidence based on the WikiLeaks exposure of data that they published, there were multiple ways that they got it. Abby Martin, then who else has corroborated your findings? Bill Binney, a number of technical people in the veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, and others around the world, by the way. Now, this difficult and complicated matter is hard to follow, primarily because the American government and the people behind the Mueller report, the CIA, the NSA, don't want you to follow it, because what it probably shows is not only illegalities by the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign, but finally straight-out murder. That they killed Seth Rich to keep him from revealing this story to you. And so the way that you get the story now is particularly complicated. You are listening to News from Neptune. There are many wheels within the wheels.
How much time do we have left, Ethan?
You guys are at 44 minutes.
Okay, thanks. Just to tag on to that, I don't really have any comments about that, but and that's fine. But I mentioned speaking of spying, I mentioned last week in relation to the Blue Waters computer at the U of I that received $11 million in Julie Wirth's News Gazette press release, publicity release, that the Blue Waters is part of something called the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and which is a broad-reaching spy, sort of NSA-related spy, federal spying outfit run by the Department of Defense, the Pentagon. And I know it's interesting, the very top article at the Counterpunch website today is by an anthropologist named David Price, who publishes frequently articles there about the relationship between academia and the military and the use of anthropologists in particular in U.S. war making. The title of the article is Militarized Observers, Institutional Daydreams of Ethics and Runs to Weaponize Culture. And a couple of excerpts here, which relates to this geospatial intelligence agency. The Department of Defense has redacted an author's identity indicating an affiliation with the Department of Defense's National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Behind this was Price's efforts to get a master's thesis released to him under a FOIA request that he thought was relevant to his work in exposing anthropologists' involvement in U.S. war making. And Price goes on, the students' committee's identities are redacted under more general FOIA exemptions protecting identities of personal privacy. This redaction of the author of a master's thesis seems an unusual withholding that marks a distance separating this sort of work from normal practices of academic accountability. And Price goes on in a broader context, and he's talking about Afghanistan and the use of anthropologists in Afghanistan, the use of ethnographic work by anthropologists there. He goes on this way. The ethos of this rising counterinsurgency era birthed history's most expensive and wasteful federally funded, I think he means, anthropological project. The almost $750 million Human Terrain Systems, HTS program, $727 million, that embedded anthropologists and other social scientists with soldiers in settings of occupations and battle zones. HTS ran from 2007 until it was terminated in 2014 with a record of failing to function as promised, institutionalized sexism, widespread mismanagement, and unaccounted for funds. Price goes on, HTS, this Human Terrain Systems program, was a boondoggle. As a con, it was succeeded by telling an unimaginably rich Mark, the Pentagon, exactly what it wanted to hear, that it could do extraordinary things with what appeared to be common undervalued objects, namely anthropologists, in much the same way that shysters seeking investors for schemes claiming that they have the secret to powering cars with tap water. HTS made wild promises about the magic beans of culture that it couldn't fulfill, and like most cons, it eventually collapsed. And it was these sort of extraordinary promises made by HTS and the counterinsurgency gurus that fed the drive of this master's thesis that led him to understand what was going on here. So, and that's the Geospatial Intelligence Agency. That's the HTS is a part of this Geospatial Intelligence Agency that I stumbled over when I was trying to figure out what this Blue Waters computer. The Blue Waters is a minor part of that report, as we stated last week. The article talked about surveilling Antarctica or these kind of massive surveillance and mapping and focusing on programs. Nothing, again, as I said next week, as I assumed, maybe this is something to do with global warming and researching global warming. No, it has to do with researching how the Pentagon will know everything that goes on everywhere.
The very interesting Gary Brecker, who has written for years under the peculiar sobriquet, the war nerd, has written about this human terrain program. It's coming and going. He was personally, if peripherally, involved with it. And although it's difficult to get your hands on the fascinating things that Brecker writes and says, a lot of it is this podcast stuff with Patreon connection and so forth. There's material there.
It's easy to use, Carl.
Refers to
it's not a problem.
Oh, this technical stuff gets to me. That's why I need other people to explain it to me.
Go to a website, click once.
Okay.
Anyway.
I'll see if I can manage it. I don't know. We have a few minutes left.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up here on the material I was talking about earlier from Craig Murray. I mentioned in passing that Murray was an interesting figure in his whole business. This is the former ambassador who was rusticated for his complaints about the torture being carried out by the head of Uzbekistan when he was a diplomatic official, a British diplomatic official in Uzbekistan, and went on to become a political courier, a political commentator with an animus against the British government and its foreign policy in this and in other matters. He was probably a courier too. He likely knows who or how those Democratic National Committee emails got to WikiLeaks because it was likely that he was one of the links in transmission. But he writes a good bit about British politics at home and abroad now, and is very much worth reading. He writes recently, quote, Douglas Adams, if you know who Douglas Adams is, good for you because you've read some good books. Douglas Adams is the science fiction author. To call him science fiction author is like, say, Mark Twain was a travel writer. But still, Douglas Adams famously suggested that the answer to life and the universe and everything is 42. In the world of the political elite, the answer is Russiagate. What has caused the electorate to turn on the political elite to defeat Hillary and to rush to Brexit? Why, the evil Russians, of course, are behind it all. It was the Russians who hacked the DNC and published Hillary's emails, thus causing her to lose the election because the Russians, damn it! Who cares what was in the emails? It was the Russians. It's the Russians who are behind WikiLeaks. And Julian Assange is a Putin agent, as is that evil Craig Murray. It was the Russians who swayed the $1,300,000,000 presidential election campaign result with $100,000 worth of Facebook ads. It was the evil Russians who once did a dodgy trade deal with Aaron Banks, then did something improbable with Cambridge Analytica that hypnotized people en masse via Facebook into supporting Brexit. All of this is known to be true by every Blairite, every Clintonite, by the BBC, by CNN, by The Guardian, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. The Russians did it. Is the article of faith for the political elite who cannot understand why the electorate rejected the triangulated consensus the elite constructed and sold to us, where the filthy rich get ever richer and the rest of us have falling incomes, low employment rights, and scanty welfare benefits. You don't like that system? You've been hypnotized and misled by evil Russian trolls and hackers. Except virtually none of this is true. Mueller's inability to defend, first, the person his deeply flawed report took a certain amount of steam out of the blame Russia campaign. But what should have killed off Russiagate forever is the judgment of Judge John G. Kettle of the Federal District Court of New York. in a lawsuit brought by the Democratic National Committee against Russia and against WikiLeaks and against inter alia Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, and Julian Assange. For the first time, the claims of collusion between Trump and Russia were subjected to actual scrutiny in a court of law. And Judge Kettle concluded that, quite simply, the claims made as the basis of Russiagate are insufficient even to warrant a hearing. The judgment is 81 pages long, but if you want to understand the truth about the entire Russiagate spin, it is well worth reading it in full. I'll post it on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. You've been watching News from Neptune. Final comment, David?
No, I think that does it.
Okay. You have been watching News from Neptune for the 32nd week of 2019, a Nagasaki Holocaust edition on the anniversary of the atom bombing of Nagasaki. A parenthetical note there that never quite understood one peculiar conjunction with all the dead people in Nagasaki. It's taken as granted now that the U.S. bombed Nagasaki to test a different kind of atom bomb. They'd already bombed Hiroshima, and even if you think there's an argument for a demonstration effect in the war, bombing Nagasaki, that was all gone because they'd done it. But they went ahead and dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, and the reason seems clearly to be that they had a different kind of bomb that they wanted to test. And they tested it by killing tens of thousands of people in this Japanese city. The Japanese city happened to be the city where in the 19th century, when Japan was opened, as Westerners say, Christianity took root. The Japanese Christian community in Nagasaki, in fact, it extended I said that wrong because the Christian community had been there for a long time, but Americans were surprised to find a thriving Christian community in Nagasaki when Japan was opened by Admiral Perry. The nature of that city was that it was not a military target at all. In fact, it had American prisoners in it who died in the blast. But the demonstration blast chose, for some reason, the city which had the longest-standing Western influence, you might say, in Japan, the Nagasaki Christians, who were killed at the same rate as the other citizens of Nagasaki. So when the U.S. remembers the anniversaries of these great crimes of the 20th century, we should realize that there are wheels within wheels here as well. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. And see the research notes on our Facebook page for information on the things we've said this evening and other materials gathered by our researchers. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune. To remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion our enemies, and a good night to you.